He bought a destroyed ranch, returns weeks later, finds 4 women hanged inside. Michael Torres wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stood in the blazing Arizona sun, staring at the auction listing on his phone for the 100th time. The photograph showed a property that had seen better days, much better days. Collapsed fences, overgrown weeds taller than a grown man, and buildings that looked like they might fall over if someone sneezed too hard. But Michael didn't see the decay. He saw possibility. At 42 years old, Michael had spent the last 20 years working as a contractor, building homes for other people, helping them realize their dreams. He had always been good with his hands, patient with problems that would frustrate others, and he had an eye for seeing what could be rather than what was. His truck was old but reliable, his tools were worn but well-maintained, and his reputation in the Phoenix area was solid. People trusted Michael Torres to do the job right. But this ranch in New Mexico wasn't for a client. This was for him. The property had been sitting abandoned for 8 long years, ever since the previous owner, an elderly man named Robert Henderson, had passed away. Henderson had no children, no close relatives who wanted the burden of a deteriorating ranch in the middle of nowhere. So it sat, year after year, becoming more wild, more forgotten. The county finally seized it for unpaid taxes and put it up for auction, hoping someone would see value in the 50 acres of scrubland and broken dreams. Michael saw that value. He saw a place where his family could build something together, away from the noise and crowds of the city. He imagined fixing up the main house, restoring the barn, maybe even getting a few horses. His daughter Emma had always wanted horses. When he first mentioned the idea to his wife Sarah over dinner one evening, she had given him that look, the one that said she loved him but sometimes questioned his judgment. Sarah was practical, a high school math teacher who believed in numbers, facts, and things that made logical sense. Buying a destroyed ranch 3 hours away in another state did not make logical sense. "Michael, we have a perfectly good house here," she had said, pushing her pasta around her plate. "Why would we want to take on something like that? Do you know how much work it would be?" "That's exactly why I want it," Michael replied, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Sarah, I've been building houses for other people my whole career. This would be ours. Something we create together as a family." Emma, their 16-year-old daughter, had looked up from her phone, a rare occurrence at dinner. "Can we really get horses?" she asked. Michael grinned. "We can get horses." That had sealed the deal, at least with Emma. Sarah took more convincing, but eventually she agreed to at least go look at the property before Michael did anything crazy like actually buying it. The following Saturday, the 3 of them drove the 3 hours from Phoenix to the remote area of New Mexico where the ranch sat waiting. The drive took them through changing landscapes, from the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, through desert highways, past small towns that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s, and finally onto a dirt road that seemed to lead to nowhere. When they finally pulled up to the property, even Michael had to admit it looked worse in person than in the photos. The main gate hung from one hinge, the wooden sign that once announced the ranch's name long since fallen and buried in weeds. The driveway was barely visible, overgrown with desert brush and dotted with deep ruts from years of neglect. As they drove slowly toward the main buildings, they passed what had once been pastures but were now just wild fields where nature had reclaimed its territory. The main house was a sad sight. It had been a beautiful adobe-style home once, probably built in the 1960s or 70s, with those classic southwestern lines and a wide porch that would have been perfect for watching sunsets. But now the porch sagged dangerously. Several windows were broken, and the front door hung open, creaking in the wind. Birds had made nests in the eaves, and there were clear signs that various animals had been using the place as shelter. Sarah got out of the truck slowly, her face showing exactly what she thought of the situation. "Michael, this is worse than I imagined." But Emma was already walking around, her phone out, taking pictures. "It's kind of cool in a creepy, abandoned movie set kind of way," she said. Michael was already in contractor mode, mentally cataloging what needed to be done. The roof would need complete replacement. The porch would have to be torn down and rebuilt. All new windows. The interior was probably a disaster, but the bones of the house looked solid enough. Adobe construction was built to last. They walked the property for over 2 hours. The barn was perhaps in the worst shape of all the buildings. Its roof had partially collapsed on one side, and the wooden walls were weathered gray and splitting. But it was huge, with good bones, and Michael could imagine it restored, painted red, maybe with a weather vane on top. There were also 2 smaller outbuildings, both in various states of collapse, a dry well that would need to be inspected, and acres of land that rolled gently toward distant hills. Despite the destruction, despite the overwhelming amount of work it would need, there was something peaceful about the place. It was quiet in a way that the city never was. The sky seemed bigger here, the air cleaner. "I know it looks bad," Michael said to Sarah as they stood together looking at the view. "But I can fix this. We can fix this. Imagine this place in a year or two. Imagine Emma learning to ride here, having her friends visit. Imagine us sitting on that porch, a new porch, watching the sunset." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. "How much are you thinking of bidding?" The auction was held online the following Tuesday. Michael sat at his laptop in their home office, Sarah standing behind him with her arms crossed. The starting bid was set at $60,000. Michael had decided his maximum was $90,000, based on his calculations of renovation costs and the property's potential value. The bidding started slow. A few early bids pushed it to $65,000, then $70,000. Michael waited patiently, not wanting to show his hand too early. But at $75,000, there seemed to be only two other bidders competing. At $80,000, one dropped out. At $82,000, Michael made his first bid. The other bidder countered immediately. $83,000. Michael bid $84,000. The counter came back. $85,000. Michael's heart was pounding. He bid $87,000, jumping up to show he was serious. There was a long pause, nearly 2 minutes where nothing happened. Sarah's hand tightened on his shoulder. Then the counter bid appeared. $80,000 to $8,000. Michael typed in his bid, $90,000. They waited. The auction timer counted down the final minutes. No counter bid came. At 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, Michael Torres became the owner of a destroyed ranch in rural New Mexico. "We're completely crazy," Sarah said, but she was smiling. Over the next week, Michael made arrangements. He needed to get permits for the renovation work, line up a crew, order materials. But first, he needed to do a thorough assessment of the property, document everything, and make the place secure. He couldn't have vandals or trespassers getting hurt on his property. 2 weeks after winning the auction, Michael drove back out to the ranch alone. Sarah had to work, and Emma had school. He spent the entire day going through every building, taking measurements, making lists, taking hundreds of photographs. The house was worse inside than he'd feared. Water damage, evidence of rodents, everything covered in years of dust and debris. But the foundation was solid, the walls were sound. It could be saved. The barn was his biggest concern. That partially collapsed roof was dangerous. He needed to get it stabilized before doing anything else, or the whole structure might come down. He made a note to hire a crew to board up the dangerous sections and shore up the supports before he brought Emma or Sarah back out here. Before he left that day, Michael walked the entire perimeter of the property, really taking it in. This was his land now. His family's land. Despite all the work ahead, despite Sarah's reservations and the tight budget they'd be on for the next few years, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He was building something real, something lasting, something that would be there for Emma, and maybe, someday, for her children. As the sun set, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Michael locked the new padlock he'd installed on the barn door, checked that the boards he'd nailed over the house's broken windows were secure, and headed back to his truck. He'd return in 3 weeks with a full crew and equipment. By then, the permits should be processed, materials ordered, everything ready to begin the real work of transformation. He had no way of knowing that when he returned everything would change, that the dream he'd built in his mind would turn into something he could never have imagined, that this peaceful, forgotten place would become the center of a nightmare that would haunt him for years to come. But on that evening, driving back toward Phoenix with the radio playing softly, Michael Torres was simply a man with a plan, a contractor with a vision, a father wanting to give his family something special. He thought about paint colors and roofing materials and whether they should go with solar panels or stick with traditional power. He thought about everything except what was coming. The morning Michael returned to the ranch started like any other Thursday. He woke up at 5:30, made coffee, and kissed Sarah goodbye while she was still half asleep. Emma had mumbled something from her room that might have been good luck or might have been nothing at all. Permits had come through earlier than expected, which meant he could get started sooner than planned. Michael saw this as a good sign. The drive out to New Mexico felt different this time. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was arriving to begin real work. His truck was loaded with tools, supplies, and equipment. Behind him, a trailer carried a small generator, ladders, and lumber for the initial boarding and stabilization work. He'd hired a local crew to meet him at the ranch at 9 o'clock. Everything was falling into place. The sun was climbing higher in the clear sky when Michael turned onto the dirt road leading to his property. The morning air was cool and pleasant, the kind of perfect weather that made physical work enjoyable rather than exhausting. He had his windows down, enjoying the quiet, imagining how different this road would look in a few months once he cleaned it up and graded it properly. As he approached the main gate, something felt off. Michael slowed his truck, squinting ahead. The gate was not just hanging from one hinge like before, but actually pushed wide open. He'd left it closed, hadn't he? He was sure he had. Maybe the wind had blown it. These old gates were unpredictable. But then he noticed the tire tracks. Fresh ones cutting through the dust of the driveway. Multiple vehicles had been here, and recently. Michael felt a flutter of unease in his stomach. Probably just local kids, he told himself. Teenagers, looking for a place to hang out, maybe have a party. It happened all the time with abandoned properties. That's why he'd put that padlock on the barn. He drove slowly up the driveway, scanning the property. Nothing looked obviously disturbed from what he could see. The house stood silent and still, just as he left it. The smaller outbuildings showed no signs of new damage, but those tire tracks continued, and they led toward the barn. Michael parked his truck near the barn and got out slowly. The morning suddenly felt too quiet. Even the birds seemed silent. He could hear his boots crunching on the gravel, his own breathing, the tick of his truck's engine cooling down. The barn loomed ahead of him, its weathered wood looking almost gray in the morning light. That's when he saw it. The padlock was broken, not cut but smashed, lying in the dirt near the barn door. The metal hasp he'd installed was bent, forced open with what must have been significant strength or a heavy tool. The barn door itself stood slightly ajar, maybe a foot of darkness visible in the gap. "Hello?" Michael called out, his voice sounding strange in the stillness. "Anyone there?" "This is private property." No answer. Just silence and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Michael stood there for a moment, debating. He should probably call the sheriff. This was clearly trespassing, possibly vandalism, but the local crew would be arriving in less than an hour, and he felt a little foolish calling the police over a broken lock. Maybe whoever had been here was long gone. Maybe they just used the barn as shelter for a night and moved on. He pulled out his phone anyway, just to be safe. No signal. Of course. He was too far out here for reliable cell service. He'd have to drive back toward the main road to get a signal, which would take 20 minutes there and back. By then, his crew would be arriving and wondering where he was. Michael made a decision. He checked the barn quickly, just to make sure no one was squatting inside and to assess any damage. If anything looked seriously wrong, he'd drive out for a signal and call the authorities. He was a big guy, 6'2" and solid from years of construction work. He could handle himself. He approached the barn door carefully, pushing it open wider. The hinges squeaked loudly in protest, a sound that made him wince. Sunlight spilled into the barn's interior, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. The smell hit him first. Musty hay, old wood, and something else, something faintly sweet and wrong. "Hello?" he called again, stepping inside. "If someone's in here, you need to leave. This is my property." His eyes adjusted slowly to the dimmer light inside the barn. The space was larger than it looked from outside, with a high ceiling and old rafters running across the top. Broken farming equipment and ancient hay bales littered the floor. Sunlight came through gaps in the walls and the partially collapsed section of roof, creating patterns of light and shadow. Michael took another step inside, and that's when he looked up. His brain couldn't process what he was seeing at first. His mind rejected it, tried to make it make sense, tried to turn it into something normal, something explainable. But there was no explaining this away. 4 women hung from the main support beam, suspended in a line, each about 6 feet apart. They wore white clothing, dresses or robes, he couldn't tell. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, their feet dangling several feet above the barn floor. They swayed very slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the faint breeze that came through the broken walls. Michael staggered backward, his hand flying to his mouth. He wanted to scream but couldn't find his voice. His heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might burst. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He'd bought a ranch, just a simple ranch. He was going to fix it up for his family. This couldn't be real. But it was real. Horribly, undeniably real. He stumbled out of the barn, his legs weak, his whole body shaking. He bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air, fighting the urge to vomit. His mind was racing, fragments of thoughts crashing into each other. He had to call someone. He had to get help. Those women. Oh, God, those women. Michael ran to his truck on legs that felt like rubber. He fumbled with his keys, dropped them, picked them up with shaking hands. He had to get to where his phone worked. He had to call 911. He threw the truck into reverse, backing up wildly, nearly hitting a fence post. Then he was speeding down the driveway, gravel spraying, driving faster than was safe on the rough road. It took him 15 minutes of desperate driving before his phone showed a signal. He pulled over so abruptly the truck skidded, and he grabbed his phone with trembling hands. He had to try 3 times to dial correctly because his fingers wouldn't work properly. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, professional. Michael's voice cracked. He swallowed hard, tried again. I found bodies at my ranch. 4 women. They're dead. They're hanging in the barn. Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me your location? Michael gave the address, his voice shaking so badly he had to repeat it twice. The operator kept him on the line, asking questions, telling him help was on the way. Were the victims definitely deceased? Yes. Had he touched anything? No. Was anyone else on the property? He didn't know. He didn't think so. Sir, I need you to stay where you are and wait for the police. Don't go back to the barn. Can you do that for me? Yes, Michael whispered. Yes, I'll wait. He sat in his truck on the side of that dusty New Mexico road, his whole body shaking, his mind replaying what he'd seen over and over. 4 women, all in white, hanging there in his barn. How long had they been there? Hours? Days? Who were they? Why were they there? Nothing made sense. The local crew he'd hired drove past at one point, saw him sitting there and slowed down. Michael waved them off frantically. They looked confused but continued on toward the ranch. He should have stopped them, but he couldn't think clearly. He could barely function. The first police car arrived 23 minutes after his call, though it felt like hours. A sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked barely out of his 20s, approached Michael's truck cautiously. Michael must have looked terrible because the deputy's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before relaxing. Sir, are you Michael Torres, the property owner? Yes, Michael managed. Yes, that's me. They're in the barn. 4 of them. I don't understand what's happening. More vehicles arrived quickly after that. Sheriff's cars, an ambulance, and eventually unmarked vehicles that Michael assumed were detectives or crime scene investigators. They asked him to lead them back to the property, which he did, following behind their convoy in his own truck. When they arrived at the ranch, his crew was standing outside their vehicles, looking confused and worried. The police quickly moved them away from the barn, establishing a perimeter. Michael watched from near his truck as officers entered the barn, saw what he'd seen, and came out looking shaken. A woman in plain clothes approached him. She was in her late 30s, Asian, with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, but not unkind. Torres? I'm Detective Lisa Chen. I'm going to need to ask you some questions. Is that all right? Of course, Michael said. Anything. I don't understand what's happening. Neither do we, not yet, Detective Chen said. But we're going to figure it out. First, I need to know, when was the last time you were on this property before today? And so it began. The questions. The timeline. Where had he been? When had he bought the property? Who else knew about it? Had he seen anyone suspicious? Did he know the victims? The questions went on and on. Michael answered everything as clearly as he could, but his mind kept drifting back to what he'd seen in that barn. He sat in the back of Detective Chen's car for hours as the crime scene unfolded around him. More people arrived, the county coroner, more investigators, people in white protective suits who went in and out of the barn. They photographed everything. They measured. They documented. Michael watched it all in a daze. At some point, someone brought him water. He drank it without tasting it. His crew had been sent home, told the work wouldn't be starting today after all. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent. And still the questions continued. Mr. Torres, Detective Chen said gently at one point. Right now you're not under arrest, but you are a person of interest in this investigation. You own the property. You discovered the bodies. We need to eliminate you as a suspect before we can move forward. Do you understand? Michael nodded numbly. A suspect. They thought he might have done this. The realization should have made him angry, but he was too exhausted, too shocked. He just wanted to go home. He wanted to hold Sarah. He wanted this to be a nightmare he could wake up from. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it was only beginning. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and unreal. Michael sat in a metal chair at a metal table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Detective Lisa Chen sat across from him, a notepad in front of her, while another detective, an older man named Rodriguez, leaned against the wall watching. They'd been at this for 6 hours. 6 hours of the same questions asked in different ways, of timeline reconstructions, of going over every detail of his purchase of the ranch, his movements over the past 3 weeks, his relationship with his wife, his financial situation, everything. "Let's go through it one more time," Detective Chen said, her voice still patient but tired. "You left the property 3 weeks ago. You put a padlock on the barn. You didn't return until this morning. Is that correct?" "Yes," Michael said, his voice hoarse from talking. "I told you, I had to wait for the permits. I had to line up the crew, order materials. I wasn't trying to avoid the place. I was preparing to start the renovation." "And during those 3 weeks, did you tell anyone about the property? Post about it on social media? Mention it to friends?" "Just my family and the crew I hired, and I guess the people I dealt with for permits and materials. I wasn't keeping it a secret, but I wasn't announcing it to the world either." Detective Rodriguez pushed off from the wall and walked closer to the table. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "Here's what's bothering me, Mr. Torres. This property has been abandoned for 8 years. Nobody cared about it. Then you buy it, and suddenly, within weeks, 4 women end up dead in your barn. That's quite a coincidence." "I know how it looks," Michael said desperately. "I know. But I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this. I don't know those women. I've never seen them before in my life." "We haven't shown you pictures of their faces," Chen said quietly. "How do you know you've never seen them?" Michael's stomach dropped. I assume. "I didn't look at them closely. I saw them, and I ran. I called you immediately." The detectives exchanged a glance. Chen made a note on her pad. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive. Michael wanted to scream, to break something, to make them understand that he was a victim here too. He'd bought a ranch. He'd had dreams, and now those dreams were shattered, replaced by a horror he couldn't comprehend. "Mr. Torres," Chen said finally, "we're going to need to take your fingerprints, your DNA. We'll need to examine your vehicle, your tools. We'll need access to your phone records, your computer. If you have nothing to hide, you'll cooperate fully. If you refuse, we'll get warrants." "Take whatever you need," Michael said. "I want you to find out what happened. I want to know who did this." What Michael didn't know, what the detectives hadn't yet told him, was that the crime scene investigators had already found something significant. In the barn, carefully hidden behind some old hay bales, they discovered a video camera on a tripod. The camera was still on, still recording, its battery finally dying just hours before Michael arrived. And on that camera's memory card was a recording that would change everything. It was nearly midnight when they finally let Michael call Sarah. She'd been frantic, calling his phone over and over, getting increasingly worried when he didn't answer. When she finally heard his voice, she started crying. "Michael, what's happening? Your crew called me. They said something about police at the ranch." "Sarah, I need you to listen to me," Michael said, his voice shaking. "I'm at the sheriff's station. I'm okay. I'm not hurt. But something terrible happened at the ranch. His voice broke. "I found 4 women. They were deceased. The police are investigating." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then Sarah's voice came back, small and scared. "What do you mean, what women? Michael, what's going on?" "I don't understand any of this, but I need you to know I had nothing to do with it. The police are questioning me, but I'm cooperating. I need you to believe me." "Of course I believe you," Sarah said immediately. "Michael, do you need a lawyer? Should I call someone?" "I don't know. Maybe. They're treating me like a suspect." "Then, yes, we need a lawyer. Don't say anything else until we get you one. I'm calling John Brennan right now." John was a lawyer friend from church, someone they'd known for years. 2 hours later, John Brennan arrived at the station, looking rumpled and concerned. He was a corporate lawyer, not a criminal attorney, but he knew enough to protect Michael's rights. He demanded to speak with his client privately, and the detectives reluctantly agreed. "Tell me everything," John said once they were alone. "And I mean everything. Don't leave anything out." Michael told him the whole story, from buying the ranch to discovering the bodies. John listened carefully, taking notes, his expression growing more troubled. "All right," John said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to continue cooperating, but carefully. Answer their questions honestly, but don't speculate. Don't guess. Only tell them what you know for certain. And if they ask you anything that makes you uncomfortable, you look at me first. Understood?" Michael nodded. "Do you think they really believe I did this? Right now, you're the most obvious suspect. You own the property. You found the bodies. They have to investigate you thoroughly before they can move on. But from what you've told me, they don't have any evidence linking you to these women. No motive, no connection. That works in your favor. What they didn't know was that, at that very moment, Detective Chen was watching the video from the camera found in the barn, and what she was seeing was making her blood run cold. The video showed 4 women entering the barn voluntarily, led by a man in his 40s with long hair and a beard. The women were smiling, peaceful, dressed in white robes. The man talked to them for a long time, his voice calm and soothing, though the audio quality was poor and Chen could only catch fragments. Words like transcendence and chosen and next level of existence. The women arranged themselves in a line, still smiling, still calm. They seemed willing, even eager. The man helped each of them, one by one, speaking softly to them the whole time. It was surreal and horrible, like watching something from another world where normal rules didn't apply. When it was done, the man stepped back, looked at the camera, and spoke directly to it. "To whoever finds this," he said, his voice clear now, "these women made their choice freely. They have transcended the limitations of this physical world. They are free now in ways you cannot understand. I am Marcus Whitfield, and I take full responsibility for helping them achieve their freedom. You will not understand. You will call this a tragedy, but it is a liberation." Then he turned and walked out of the barn, leaving the camera running, leaving the scene behind him. Chen sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't a murder in the traditional sense. This was something far more complex and disturbing. She pulled up her computer and started searching the name Marcus Whitfield. What she found made the picture clearer and more troubling. Marcus Whitfield was the leader of a group called the Ascension Path, a spiritual community that had been under investigation in 3 different states for potential fraud and manipulation. Former members had described it as a harmful organization that isolated people from their families and took control of their finances. 6 days ago, according to missing persons reports Chen quickly pulled up, 4 women from an Ascension Path retreat in Colorado had disappeared. Their families had reported them missing, but there was no evidence of abduction. The women had simply vanished, taking nothing with them but the clothes they were wearing. The women in the barn matched the descriptions of the missing women perfectly. Chen immediately called in Rodriguez and the FBI. This was bigger than a local case now. This was interstate, possibly involving additional victims, and they had a suspect who was likely on the run. "We need to release Torres," Chen said to Rodriguez. "He's not our guy. We've got our actual suspect on video." "You sure?" Rodriguez asked, though he looked relieved. He'd never really believed the contractor was responsible. The man's shock and horror had been too genuine. I'm sure. Get him out of interrogation and show him the basics of what we know. He deserves to understand what happened on his property." When Michael was brought back into the room and told he was no longer a suspect, the relief that washed over him was so intense he nearly collapsed. John Brennan gripped his shoulders, steadying him. "We found a video," Chen explained gently. "We know who did this. His name is Marcus Whitfield. We believe the women who were found on your property were part of a group he leads. This wasn't random, Mr. Torres. Whitfield specifically chose your barn for reasons we're still investigating." "But why?" Michael asked, bewildered. "Why my property? I just bought it. How would he even know about it?" "We're looking into that," Chen said. "We've discovered that Whitfield has connections to this area. His grandfather used to work on ranches in this region decades ago, possibly including yours when it was still operational. We think he'd been scouting abandoned properties looking for a location isolated enough for what he planned. The FBI arrived within hours, turning the small sheriff's station into a command center. Michael was interviewed again, but this time as a witness rather than a suspect. Michael studied the picture, a man in his 40s with intense eyes and a charismatic smile that somehow made Michael's skin crawl. "No," Michael said, "I've never seen him." They showed him pictures of the 4 women taken from their driver's licenses and family photos. They looked so alive in these pictures, so normal. They had names now. Rebecca Sanchez, 32, a nurse from Denver. Amanda Cho, 28, who'd worked at a bookstore. Jennifer Walsh, 41, a divorced mother of 2. And Susan Martinez, 35, a teacher. Real people with real lives, now gone. "How did he do this to them?" Michael asked quietly. "How did he convince them?" "That's what we're trying to understand," the FBI agent, a woman named Cooper, said. "Whitfield has been operating the Ascension Path for 7 years. Former members describe him as extremely manipulative, charismatic. He isolates people from their support systems, breaks down their sense of self, rebuilds their identity around loyalty to him and his teachings. By the time someone is deeply involved, they'll do almost anything he asks. Michael felt sick. Their families, do they know? We're notifying them now, Cooper said softly. It's the hardest part of this job. Michael was finally allowed to leave the station at 4 a.m. John Brennan drove him home in silence. When they pulled up to Michael's house, Sarah was waiting on the porch wrapped in a blanket despite the warm night. She ran to him and Michael held her, finally allowing himself to break down. Emma appeared in the doorway, her young face frightened and confused. Dad, what's happening? Michael couldn't answer. He just held his family and cried for the first time since finding those women in his barn. He cried for them, for their families, for his shattered dreams, for the innocence that had been ripped away from all of them. The FBI had told him they were launching a massive manhunt for Marcus Whitfield. Every law enforcement agency in the region was looking for him. He couldn't hide forever. But right now, standing on his front porch holding his wife and daughter, Michael knew that even when they caught Whitfield, nothing would ever be the same. The ranch he'd bought with such hope was now a crime scene, a place of death. And the images of what he'd seen in that barn would haunt him for the rest of his life. The days after Michael's release from questioning blurred together in a haze of sleeplessness and anxiety. He couldn't close his eyes without seeing those 4 figures in white swaying gently in the darkness of the barn. Sarah had to practically force him to eat, to shower, to do anything resembling normal life. Emma moved around the house quietly, watching her father with worried eyes, not knowing what to say or how to help. The media found out about the case within 48 hours. Suddenly, news vans were parked outside their Phoenix home, reporters shouting questions whenever anyone came or went. Mr. Torres, how did you feel when you found the bodies? Did you know the victims? Are you still planning to develop the property? The questions were invasive, insensitive, relentless. Sarah had to take time off from teaching. She couldn't focus on algebra equations and classroom management when her husband was falling apart and strangers were camped on their lawn. She closed all the curtains, stopped answering the phone unless she recognized the number, and held her family together through sheer force of will. We should sell the ranch, she said one evening as they sat in the darkened living room. The TV was on mute, showing yet another news story about the case. We should get rid of it as soon as the police release the property. We can't, Michael said dully. Not yet. It's still a crime scene, and even when they do release it, who's going to buy property where 4 women were found like that? It's worthless now. Then we walk away. Let the bank take it. We'll lose the money, but at least we'll be free of it. Michael didn't respond. He was staring at the television where a picture of Marcus Whitfield filled the screen. The man looked so ordinary, so normal. He could have been anyone, a teacher, a salesman, a neighbor. How did someone who looked so regular convince 4 women to end their own lives? The FBI had been working around the clock, following every lead. Agent Cooper called Michael every few days with updates, treating him with a kindness he desperately needed. We're making progress, she'd say. We've tracked his movements to the border region. We've got people watching for him. But days turned into a week, and Whitfield remained free. The investigation revealed more disturbing details about the Ascension Path. Former members came forward with stories of manipulation and control. Families of the victims spoke to the media, their grief raw and public. Michael watched these interviews, feeling a complicated mix of sympathy and guilt, even though he knew intellectually that none of this was his fault. Then the anger started coming. Not from everyone, but from some of the victims' families. Jennifer Walsh's ex-husband gave an interview where he lashed out at Michael. That man bought property and didn't even secure it properly. If he'd been more responsible, this might not have happened there. My daughter's mother is gone, and I can't even tell them the full truth about how she passed because it's too horrible. The words stung, even though Michael knew they were coming from a place of grief and pain. Sarah saw the interview too, and was furious. That's not fair, she said. You put a lock on the barn. You did everything you could. That man is looking for someone to blame, and you're an easy target. But the criticism continued. A local news opinion piece questioned why Michael had bought such remote property without doing more to secure it, even though he'd owned it for less than a month when the incident occurred. Online comments were even worse. People who knew nothing about the situation passed judgment, called him negligent, suggested he must have known something. The financial pressure was mounting, too. Michael wasn't working. He couldn't focus. Couldn't imagine going to a job site and making small talk with clients, but bills didn't stop coming. The mortgage on their Phoenix home, the loan for the ranch, insurance, utilities, everything kept demanding payment. Our savings were draining fast. "I need to go back to work," Michael said one morning. "We can't afford for me to just sit here." "You're not ready," Sarah said. "We don't have a choice." He tried. He really did. He showed up at a renovation job for a client who'd been patient and understanding about the delay. But on the second day, when he had to work in an old barn that the client was converting into a studio, Michael had a panic attack. He stood in the doorway, his heart racing, his breath coming in gasps, unable to step inside. The client found him sitting on the ground with his head between his knees and gently suggested that maybe Michael should take more time. His therapist, Dr. Rachel Morrison, explained that he was experiencing post-traumatic stress. "What you saw was deeply disturbing," she said during one of his twice-weekly sessions. "Your brain is trying to process an experience that doesn't fit into your normal understanding of the world. This is going to take time." "I don't have time," Michael said. "I'm losing everything, my business, my savings, that ranch. I can't even look at my daughter without feeling like I've failed her." "You haven't failed anyone, Doctor," Morrison said firmly. "You're a victim of circumstances beyond your control. The question now is how you move forward." But moving forward seemed impossible when the past kept pulling him back. The ranch sat there 3 hours away, abandoned again but now infamous. The local sheriff's department had posted deputies to keep trespassers away, but people still tried to get in. Ghost hunters and morbidly curious strangers tested the boundaries, looking for a glimpse of the notorious barn. 2 weeks after Michael's discovery, the FBI finally got their break. Marcus Whitfield was spotted at a gas station just north of the Mexican border. He'd grown a beard and dyed his hair, but someone recognized him from the news coverage. Local police moved in quickly, and after a brief standoff where Whitfield barricaded himself in a motel room, he was taken into custody. Agent Cooper called Michael personally. "We got him," she said, and Michael could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "He's in custody. He won't hurt anyone else." The relief Michael felt was real but incomplete. Catching Whitfield didn't undo what had happened. It didn't erase the images from Michael's mind or restore his ability to sleep through the night. But it was something. It was a step toward closure, whatever that meant. Whitfield's interrogation, parts of which were leaked to the media, revealed a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He showed no remorse for the deaths of the 4 women. Instead, he spoke about them as if he'd done them a favor, as if he'd freed them from something. The detachment in his voice, the cold certainty, made Michael's blood run cold when he heard the recordings. The trial, when it was scheduled, would be held in New Mexico, since that's where the incident occurred. The prosecutor's office reached out to Michael, explaining he'd likely be called as a witness. Just the thought of it exhausted him, but he agreed. Those women deserved justice. Their families deserved answers. It was during this time that something unexpected happened. A woman named Patricia Sanchez called the Torres home. She was Rebecca Sanchez's mother, one of the victims. Sarah answered the phone, expecting another reporter ready to hang up, but Patricia's voice was gentle, sad. "I don't want anything from you," Patricia said. "I just wanted to talk to your husband, if he's willing. I wanted to tell him that I don't blame him." Sarah handed the phone to Michael with shaking hands. He took it reluctantly. "Well, Mr. Torres, my name is Patricia Sanchez. My daughter was Rebecca. She was the oldest of the 4 women you found." Michael's throat tightened. "Mrs. Sanchez, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "Please don't apologize," Patricia said, and her voice cracked. "I know what some people are saying about you, and it's not right. You didn't cause this. That monster Whitfield caused this. You just had the terrible misfortune of being connected to it." Tears were streaming down Michael's face. "I wish I could have done something. I wish I'd checked the barn sooner, or—" "There was nothing you could have done," Patricia interrupted. "The FBI told me the timeline. By the time you owned that property, my Rebecca was already under Whitfield's control. This was going to happen somewhere, and it happened to be your land. That's not your fault." They talked for almost an hour. Patricia told him about Rebecca, about the bright, caring daughter she'd been before Whitfield got his hooks into her. She told him about the frustration of watching someone you love be manipulated and being powerless to stop it. And she told him something else. "The other mothers, Jennifer's mom and Susan's mom, we've been talking. Amanda's parents, too. We're all grieving, all trying to make sense of this. And we had an idea, but we wanted to talk to you first before we did anything." "What kind of idea?" Michael asked. "We want to do something with that property, something good. Something that honors our daughters and helps other people who might be vulnerable to groups like Whitfield's. We were thinking maybe a center, a place that educates people about manipulative organizations, that helps people who've escaped from them. We could call it the Four Sisters Memorial for our girls." Michael was stunned. You want to use my ranch? Only if you're willing. We know it's asking a lot. But right now, that place is just a site of tragedy. We want to turn it into something that prevents future tragedies. We want something good to come from this horror. Michael couldn't speak for a moment. His mind was reeling. Use the ranch, the place that haunted his nightmares, and turn it into something positive? It seemed impossible. It seemed crazy. It seemed like exactly what needed to happen. I don't know, he said honestly. I need to think about it. Talk to my family. It's a lot. Of course, Patricia said. Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere. That night, Michael told Sarah and Emma about the conversation. Sarah's initial reaction was disbelief. They want to do what? Michael, you can't be seriously considering this? But Emma surprised them both. I think it's beautiful, she said quietly. Those women died for nothing, for a lie that man told them. But if that place could help other people, educate them, maybe save someone else's daughter, wouldn't that give their deaths meaning? But the cost, Sarah protested. The emotional cost to your father? Having to be connected to that place, to those memories. I'm already connected, Michael said slowly. Whether I like it or not, I'm part of this story. Maybe Emma's right. Maybe this is a way to make something good come from something terrible. Over the next several weeks, the idea took shape. The families created a nonprofit organization. They launched a fundraising campaign that, to everyone's surprise, gained significant traction. People who'd been following the story, who'd been horrified by what happened, wanted to help. Donations came in from around the country. Mental health professionals and experts on manipulative groups volunteered their time. Architects offered to design the center pro bono. The community that had initially been just a collection of grieving families and one traumatized contractor began to grow into something larger, something purposeful. Michael agreed to donate the land to the nonprofit. It would clear him of the financial burden and legal liability. More importantly, it would transform the ranch from a place of personal trauma into something that could help others. But agreeing to it intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. Michael still woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, seeing those four figures hanging in the darkness. He still couldn't work in enclosed spaces without anxiety clawing at his chest. The therapy helped, but healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. The legal proceedings moved forward. Whitfield was formally charged with 4 counts of assisting self-harm, resulting in death, manipulation, and a host of other charges. His lawyers tried to argue that the women had acted of their own free will, but the prosecution had the video, had testimony from former Ascension Path members about Whitfield's methods of control, had evidence of systematic manipulation. The trial was set for 8 months away. Until then, Michael and the families had to wait, had to live with their grief and trauma, had to trust that justice would be served. But they weren't waiting passively. They were building something. They were taking their pain and transforming it into purpose. And while that didn't erase what happened, it gave them a direction to move in, a way forward through the darkness. 8 months felt like both an eternity and a blink of an eye. The trial of Marcus Whitfield dominated those months, casting a long shadow over everyone involved. Michael attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the courtroom alongside the families of the 4 women. It was grueling, painful, but necessary. He needed to see this through to the end. The prosecution built their case methodically. They called former members of the Ascension Path who testified about Whitfield's methods, how he isolated people from their families, convinced them to hand over their money, made them dependent on his approval for everything. They showed the jury the video from the barn, though Michael closed his eyes during that part. He never wanted to see those images again. Whitfield's defense attorney tried to argue that the women had made their own choices, that Whitfield had simply been a spiritual guide, but the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages showed Whitfield specifically instructing the women to keep their plans secret from their families. Financial records showed he'd drained their bank accounts in the weeks before their disappearance. And the psychological experts explained in detail how manipulation works, how someone's ability to make free choices can be systematically destroyed. Michael took the stand on the 4th day of the trial. The prosecutor asked him to describe finding the bodies, and he did, his voice steady but quiet. He looked at Whitfield only once during his testimony. The man sat at the defense table looking almost bored, as if this entire proceeding was beneath him. That look of detached superiority made Michael's hands clench into fists. "Mr. Torres," the prosecutor asked, "did you have any prior knowledge that your property would be used for this purpose?" "None whatsoever," Michael said firmly. "I bought that ranch to fix it up for my family. I wanted to build something good there. I never imagined anything like this could happen." The defense attorney's cross-examination tried to paint Michael as negligent, as someone who should have better secured his property. But the prosecutor objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most of those objections. Michael wasn't on trial here. He was a witness, a victim of circumstance. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The families wept. Michael felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even fully realized was there. It wasn't joy, exactly. Justice didn't bring back the 4 women, but it was something. It was accountability. Whitfield showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Even at sentencing, when the judge gave him 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, he remained stone-faced. But as he was being led out of the courtroom, he looked directly at Michael. Their eyes met for just a second, and Michael saw something there. Not remorse, not regret, but a cold calculation. As if even now Whitfield was analyzing, strategizing, looking for angles. Then he was gone, led away to spend the rest of his life in prison, and Michael could finally breathe. Outside the courthouse, the families gathered together. Patricia Sanchez hugged Michael tightly. "Thank you for being here every day," she said. "It meant a lot to us, knowing we weren't alone." "We're all in this together," Michael said, and he meant it. Over the months of preparation and trial, these families had become more than just people connected by tragedy. They'd become his friends, his support system. They understood what he was going through in ways even Sarah couldn't fully grasp. The Four Sisters Memorial Ranch project had been moving forward during the trial. The architect's plans were finalized. A beautiful center with counseling rooms, a library, classroom spaces, and a peaceful garden area. The fundraising campaign had exceeded all expectations, bringing in not just enough money to build the center, but to establish an endowment that would keep it running for years to come. Michael had made several trips back to the property during those months, each one easier than the last. The first time, just 3 months after the incident, had been extraordinarily difficult. He'd sat in his truck outside the gate for 20 minutes before finding the courage to drive through. Sarah had come with him, holding his hand as they walked the property together. The barn had been dismantled by then, taken apart piece by piece and hauled away. The families had agreed it couldn't stay. Too much pain was soaked into those wooden boards. Where it had stood, there was now just empty ground, but plans showed that space would become the memorial garden. "Are you okay?" Sarah had asked him as they stood where the barn had been. "No," Michael had said honestly. "But I will be. Someday." Now 10 months after that horrible discovery, Michael stood on the same spot as construction crews worked around him. The main house had been fully renovated, transformed into the center's administrative offices and counseling spaces. The outbuildings were being converted into classrooms and meeting rooms. And where the barn had stood, landscapers were creating a garden with 4 flowering trees, one for each of the women. Emma had helped design the garden. She was in her senior year now, applying to colleges with plans to study social work. The experience had changed her, matured her in ways that made Michael both proud and sad. She'd lost some of her innocence, but she'd gained purpose. "Dad, come see this," Emma called now, waving him over to where workers were installing a stone marker. On it were inscribed 4 names: Rebecca Sanchez, Amanda Cho, Jennifer Walsh, and Susan Martinez. Below their names, a quote, "From darkness we choose to create light." Patricia and the other mothers had chosen those words together. They'd debated many options, but this one felt right. It acknowledged the horror of what had happened, while affirming their decision to respond with something positive. "It's beautiful," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. The grand opening of the Four Sisters Memorial Ranch was scheduled for 3 weeks later. The event drew a larger crowd than anyone anticipated. Media coverage of the trial had kept the story in the public consciousness, but more than that, people seemed genuinely interested in what the center was trying to accomplish. Local politicians came to show support. Mental health professionals attended, excited about the resources the center would provide. Former members of various manipulative groups came, some speaking publicly for the first time about their experiences. And, of course, the families were there, dressed in white, a reclamation of the color that had once symbolized tragedy. Michael stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of over 200 people. Sarah and Emma sat in the front row, both smiling encouragingly at him. He'd written a speech, revised it a dozen times, but now, looking at all these faces, he set his notes aside and spoke from the heart. 10 months ago, I bought this property with a dream," he began. "I was going to fix it up, make it beautiful, create something my family could be proud of. Instead, I found myself in the middle of a nightmare. I found 4 women who'd been manipulated and controlled by someone they trusted, someone who abused their faith and their vulnerability in the worst possible way." He paused, gathering himself. "For a long time, I hated this place. I hated what it represented. I had nightmares about it. I couldn't work, couldn't function. I thought my life was ruined. But then, these incredible families, Patricia, Maria, Susan's mother Gloria, and Amanda's parents David and Lynn, they reached out to me, and they proposed something I never could have imagined. They wanted to turn this place of tragedy into a place of healing and education. Michael gestured to the buildings around them. This center exists because they refused to let their daughters' deaths be meaningless. It exists because they chose to respond to darkness with light. And I'm honored to have been able to contribute to that vision. This isn't my project anymore. It belongs to all of us. It belongs to everyone who needs a safe place to heal, to learn, to understand how manipulation works, and how to protect themselves and their loved ones. The applause was long and heartfelt. Patricia spoke next, then a psychologist who specialized in recovery from manipulative groups, then a young woman who'd escaped from a situation similar to what the 4 victims had experienced. Each speaker added layers to the center's mission, making it real and tangible. After the formal program, people toured the facilities, and Michael walked through the rooms, watching visitors examine the educational displays about recognizing manipulation, the library stocked with resources, the counseling spaces designed to feel safe and welcoming. In the garden, people stood quietly by the memorial stone, some leaving flowers. An elderly man approached Michael as he stood by the memorial. "Mr. Torres? I'm Robert Henderson's brother." Robert was the previous owner of this property? Michael shook his hand, surprised. "I never knew Mr. Henderson had family." "We weren't close," the man admitted. "Robert and I had a falling out years ago, but I wanted you to know he would have approved of this." Robert was a good man. He believed in helping people. "I think he'd be pleased to know his property ended up serving a purpose like this." "Thank you for telling me that," Michael said. It was a small thing, but it felt significant somehow, like another piece of closure. As the sun began to set, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant colors, the crowd gradually dispersed. The families lingered, walking the garden together, sharing memories of their daughters. Michael watched them from a distance, giving them privacy in their grief and healing. Sarah came up beside him, slipping her hand into his. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Michael said honestly. "But good. Better than I have in a long time. This feels right." "It is right," Sarah said. "What you've done here, what you've helped create, I'm proud of you." "I didn't do much. The families did the real work." "You gave them the space to do it, literally. And you've been here every step of the way, even when it was hard. That matters." Emma joined them, her phone out taking pictures of the sunset. "This place is going to help so many people," she said. "I was reading the schedule for the first month. They're already fully booked with support groups and educational workshops." Michael looked at the center, the garden, the peaceful evenings settling over the property. This wasn't the dream he'd started with. He'd never gotten his horses, never fixed up the ranch house for his family, never built the quiet retreat he'd imagined. But somehow what existed here now felt more important than his original dream. He still had nightmares sometimes. He still couldn't work in barns or enclosed spaces without feeling anxious. Therapy was ongoing, and Dr. Morrison said it might take years before the trauma fully processed. But he was healing. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely healing. The Four Sisters Memorial Ranch officially opened its doors for services the following Monday. Michael wasn't there. He decided he needed to step back to let the center be run by the people trained to do so. But he followed the reports, read the testimonials from people who attended the programs, saw the statistics about lives being changed. 3 months after the opening, Michael finally returned to work. Not full-time at first, just small projects, rebuilding his confidence and his client base. People who'd known him before were understanding and supportive. New clients sometimes recognized his name from the news coverage, but most people were kind. They understood he'd been a victim too. A year after finding the bodies, Michael made a trip to the ranch, now officially called the Four Sisters Memorial Ranch in all documents and signage. The anniversary wasn't something to celebrate, but the families had organized a small private gathering to remember and reflect. As Michael walked through the garden, now lush and beautiful with mature plants and flowering trees, he thought about everything that had happened, about how a simple dream of fixing up an old ranch had turned into a nightmare, about how that nightmare had somehow transformed into something meaningful. He stopped at the memorial stone, reading the 4 names he'd memorized long ago. "I hope this honors you," he said quietly. "I hope wherever you are, you know that something good came from what happened to you." The wind rustled through the trees. Rebecca's tree, Amanda's tree, Jennifer's tree, Susan's tree. For just a moment, standing there in the garden, Michael felt something like peace. He would never forget what he'd seen in that barn. The trauma would always be part of his story, but it wasn't his whole story anymore. He'd survived. He'd helped create something positive from tragedy. He'd learned that even in the darkest moments, communities could choose light over darkness, healing over hatred, purpose over paralysis. As he walked back to his truck, Patricia called out to him. "Michael, wait. We're having a little gathering inside. Will you join us?" He looked at the center, at the families gathered there, at Emma and Sarah waiting for him by the entrance. His family, his community. His unlikely journey from contractor to survivor to advocate. "Yes," Michael said, smiling genuinely for the first time in what felt like forever. "I'll join you." And he did, stepping into the building that stood where destruction had once reigned, where hope had replaced horror, where the memory of 4 women would live on not as victims but as the inspiration for countless others to find freedom, safety, and healing. But perhaps in the end, it had become something even more important than he'd originally imagined.